Hello, everyone, and welcome to Textile Talks. Thanks again so much to all of our sponsors who make this wonderful programming happen. Don't forget to make a donation to your favorite organizations that are putting on the Textile Talks. We've all really enjoyed these for the last couple of years, and we want to keep this program going. My name is Carolyn Ducey. I'm the Ardis B. James Curator of Collections at the International Quilt Museum here in Lincoln, Nebraska, sunny Lincoln, Nebraska. I see a lot of you are enjoying sunny weather too on the chats. It's lovely to have some bright and warm weather for a break for us here in Nebraska from the cold winter. I want to remind everybody that during our program, if you have questions, please use the Q&A button. The chat is your opportunity to say hello to those of us that are on the program today, but we will be watching the Q&A for your questions and try to take as many of those as we can today. So welcome to Black at Work, Engaging Youth Through Textiles and Art Making. I'm joined today by Sadé, Ayorinde, and Chadric Devin, who are two students who came to the International Quilt Museum and really just wanted to do a project. They wanted to do some community engagement. And it really has just been a wonderful evolution of this idea that they came to us with, and they have done an amazing job bringing in the Arts and Humanities Focus Program, which is a program of our Lincoln Public Schools where students actually go to a secondary site. My daughter actually was a student at the Arts and Humanities program in one of their first years, and it just gives the students an opportunity to focus on different topics that they particularly love. And they have been great partners with us throughout the museum's history. So Sadé and Chadric really were challenged to come up with an exhibition that, well, I'm going to let them tell you about how it started, but it was a challenging focus, and they came up with a great exhibition. And then they took this exhibition to the high school students and asked them to produce artwork. So Chadric and Sadé are UNL graduates. They met here as UNL graduate students. And I didn't know until we had a program the other night when Chadric said it had been 10 years since you had been in school together and that you then reconnected. So Sadé and Chadric, welcome. We're just delighted to have you, and we can't wait to hear more about Black at Work.
Thank you, Carolyn. We're really excited to be here. There's a crazy amount of people on here. We're really excited to chat with you guys. So thanks for giving us the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yes, I want to extend the same thanks to you, the museum, to everybody who's attending today, as well as the sort of consortium of organizations who put this on. This is a really wonderful opportunity for us. So thank you for having us here. All right, so I guess I'll begin talking about the show Sadé and I curated called Black at Work. And today what we want to talk a little bit about was how this exhibition came to be and how we utilized that to create educational programming for youth in the city of Lincoln, Nebraska. Oops. So when as Carolyn mentioned, Sadé and I met when we were students in Lincoln. I was working as a studio artist. Sadé was studying art history, and we came together through various organizations as well as a friendship. And one of the things that drew us together and brought us together was our interest in the ways that the arts can bring communities together, and the way that we can introduce various projects and connect the people within our communities to museums and create educational experiences that promote visual literacy and just a deeper love and passion for the arts. So we engaged in a lot of projects together. And as Carolyn mentioned, I wasn't even thinking about it till a few months back that it had been nearly a decade since Sadé and I were in school together and had done some projects. So she sort of called me up and said, hey, let's do something. It's been a while. Let's re-engage these communities that were such a huge part of our development as artists and historians, which was Lincoln, Nebraska. So we did the email version of cold calling institutions, asking, hey, we love reaching out to communities. Would you be willing to partner with us? And the Quilt Museum emerged as someone very willing to partner with us. We were excited how willing and anxious they were to work with us. They were working on this major exhibition that's on display now called, it's from the collection of Dr. Carolyn Ducey. I'm sure many of you have heard of her, looked at her work and her collection, her scholarship. And so we really use that exhibition. In our conversations, they said, hey, we have this alternative space. You can do whatever you want with it. I was blown away when Leslie, the director, told us we could do whatever we wanted. So we began thinking about what we could offer would connect with this exhibition. And one of the reoccurring themes was storytelling. How do the arts, how do quilt makers, how do people who use textiles convey and communicate stories through their art making? So we began to think, how might Sadé and I utilize the collection of quilts at the museum to tell our own story? And furthermore, how might we introduce this to youth within Lincoln to help them see the ways that they can tell their own stories through art making and forms of visual literacy? So as we were beginning to think, well, where do we even start with an exhibition? The color Black was a unique, visually interesting, almost unexpected formal thing that we were both really drawn to. Like, why do artists use Black? Why are quilt makers choosing this fabric? And what are the various ways that Black is not just sort of this passive aesthetic thing, but it actually has an agency, that it can be at work for us? So we began to delve into that.
And to the quilts that we were offered to use for this particular space in the museum were the museum's education collection, which is really interesting in what it has and also what it doesn't have. And so as we were searching through, I think there were a couple of quilts that struck us because they had Black figures in them. And so I think initially we were thinking, oh, maybe we could do something, especially as it relates to Mazlumi's collection, maybe we could do something with these Black figures and create a show. And then we quickly realized that there wasn't going to be enough of those for us to use. So as Chadric said, because we wanted to work with Black and think about Black, we sort of thought a little bit more broadly about how Black might show up. So we ended up creating 3 major sections for this show, which I'll talk through here in a second, which are illusion, concept, and contrast, and how we saw Black as working in those. But in general, the sort of overview of what we're doing here is we're looking at how quilt makers have used Black as either a visual or a conceptual element. And actually, in a few of the quilts, those things are happening at the same time, right? So Chadric and I in general see color as this serious and active representational tool that really changes the ways that people see the world around them. And so we wanted to really dive into that with a shade that we're both really fond of for various reasons. I think Black is really a constant in our research and in our art making and in our wardrobe. So it was like really, it was really a natural draw for us. So for this exhibition, we positioned Black really as essential to our experience of objects in space. And we wanted to reflect on the way it generates contrast and renders illusion and gives dimension, and how it is part of how we shape our social thoughts and categorization. She can go to the next slide. So this is just an installation view of sort of the introduction to our show, and I will walk you around clockwise to get through each of the sections. So the first section is Black as illusion. And you can see that we have a range of different quilts that and what Black is up to in some of these quilts that you can see. There's the illusion of depth, there's Black sort of obscuring details and creating shadows, and so on. You can go to the next slide. And then the next slide. And so tumbling blocks we'll just use as a really clear and basic example of what we're after for this section. Clearly, here, Black is at work creating the impression of stacked cubes, though we know that this image is flat. The way that the Black is positioned next to the Black squares, or I guess we decided they were rhombuses at some point. The way the Black rhombuses are positioned next to the white and the blue gives the illusion that we're looking at a 3D image, though we're not. So the next section is Black as concept, and there were two quilts in this section. You can see the schoolhouse quilt on the wall, and then a quilt that we'll delve into here called Black Boy on the ground. And we really wanted to use these quilts to help us think through our social associations with the word and the color and the category Black. So this quilt in particular was certainly the most talked about quilt when Chadric and I were giving tours of this space. Many described sort of being shocked as they looked at it up close, because it sort of starts out as a simple show of just Black figures. You can see here, they almost become like geometric, shapes in and of themselves, along with the zigzag pattern. But upon closer inspection, they have little buttons for eyes and a red mouth and kind of snarling teeth. And so these figures come in clear as representations of racial stereotype. So Black here is really at work, loaded with centuries old ideas and expectations about Black people and their lives and their behaviors and their place in society, which we've seen play out tragically over the last 10 years or 100 years or 400 years. And I think in particular, one of the discussions that we were having around the quilts in the gallery, this quilt in the gallery, is the idea of the sort of reemergence of this minstrel mask in the 1980s when the quilt was made. So one of the things that we know about the maker, Hortense Beck, is that she liked to copy quilts that she saw. Most of her representations in the Quilt Museum are copies. I don't think that there are any that are her original design. And so the pattern that we see here came from an earlier decade. We don't know exactly what year the quilt was made that she's referencing here, that she's recreating, but there are other examples of this quilt that date to the 40s. So it's interesting, although I don't think entirely unexpected, that that there's this draw to reproduce this kind of imagery at the end of the 20th century. When it was mostly banned and really seen infrequently in popular culture. However, in the 40s and the first, at the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century and into mid-century, it was really, really commonplace. So this is just, some of the conversations that we were having around this quilt and trying to explore, what was at play and what the motivations would have been, and the sort of lasting legacy of an image like this over time. So lastly, we have Black as contrast, which really simply put, Black as the darkest possible color is often used to create brilliant contrast when it's placed next to other colors, and we wanted to explore that in this section. So with an example like Roman stripe, Black is at work amplifying the intensity of the red. So like most objects, this is better seen in person. I don't think that the red here is really, I don't think this picture does the red justice because it's really vibrant when you see it in person. But I do think that what shows here and what shows in some of the other examples that we have in this section is really how, depending on your gaze or your position, how you're looking, the Black can really sort of come forward. So it's the more dominant color, or it can really recede to sort of let its neighboring colors really shine through. So now that we had this exhibition, we had an idea, we had picked some quilts, we had, started writing the interpretation, we needed a partner. And so as Carolyn mentioned in the beginning, we ended up landing with the Lincoln Public Schools Arts and Humanities program. And we were really excited. We thought this was a strong partner because this group of students was already spending so much of their time thinking creatively and sort of being tasked with making things and exploring their ideas in different artistic ways, whether that be, painting or drawing or writing poetry. So we were really glad to land this particular partner. So our time in the classroom was really built on two separate sections. We had the in-class discussion section and an art making section. And as Chadric indicated in the beginning, teaching visual literacy and encouraging visual literacy has been something that he and I have been passionate about for a really long time. I think both in our experiences teaching in the museum, teaching in the classroom, doing research, working with the public, it's, I think, clear that people are timid when it comes to looking at and talking about or hazarding a guess at an interpretation about art. And we want to encourage people to look and think critically about all images. Art history definitely that it's set up to have you look at an image and interpret and critique. But we also believe that any image, popular culture, anything that you see on TV, mass media, all images should be critiqued, should be examined closely to see what you can draw out of them. And so we really wanted to work with the students to see if we could develop that for them and with them. So we looked at a number of different art examples so that we could show them how artists are using Black in particular, but more broadly, all of the elements. So we focused on, color, line, shape, texture in our work, and really tried to highlight how taking any one of these elements and picking it apart could open up the world of interpretive possibilities if you're looking at an image. So this is one example of an artist that we talked about, Kara Walker, and she uses Black really intelligently as a conceptual component in her work. So as you can see, there's a whole group of silhouetted figures here, and her work really is thinking about Blackness in America and slavery and its aftermath and the nature of stereotypes. And so she gives us these life-size blacked out figures that really suggest human shadows and that force the viewer to assign race and gender and particular kinds of activity based on the limited information that Black really gives us. All we give here is an outline of a figure, and through that, in looking, you have to tap into your own sense of known or maybe unconscious stereotype to say, well, what is a woman, what characteristics tell me that this is a woman, or what characteristics tell me this is a man, or what characteristics tells me that this person is Black or white, or who has power. And so Black for Kara Walker really helps to obscure any real details about who you're looking at, and as such, like what they're doing. And then an artist like Fred Wilson is also using Black conceptually, again, thinking about race, and working with Venetian glass to make this chandelier. So he's really exploring ideas of tradition and wealth and class and privilege in this piece, and how race is brought into or left out of those histories and those spaces and those conversations. So along with talking about the sort of duality of light and dark, and with the students and the kind of issues of wealth and privilege, as I stated, we also just talked about how stunning and unexpected it is to see an art object like this, or an object like this in Black. And we really challenged the students to express what kinds of emotions or ideas that a work like this can evoke when you're seeing something, an object that you're familiar with, but in a new light. So this piece, this op art, or otherwise known as optical art work by Bridget Riley, is obviously an example of illusion. And op art, became really popular in the 1960s, a really popular sort of development in painting around mid-century. And artists were really focusing on geometric shapes and how they could be transformed into various optical effects. So many of these works were black and white, or I guess in this case, kind of off-white, but artists were really playing around with the power of contrast to really trick the eye. And then lastly, speaking of contrast, we had this brilliant Caravaggio, and we chatted with the students about how Black was being used as contrast in this work. So Caravaggio his work is sort of loaded with this really delicious play on light and dark, and he was really a master at creating shadow. So here, because of how Narcissus is like emerging from the deep dark background, we're able to focus on him and really nothing else, which is just the way he's focusing on himself and nothing else. So the way that Black is used here as contrast makes not only the other colors that are present stand out, but the figure itself. So now we're like implicated in this looking, and it's really quite masterful. So after we spent time thinking about and looking at all of these images, we tasked the students at making artwork that engaged these themes that we had spent the few weeks talking about.
So one of the things that I really loved about our interactions and work with the students and presenting some of these works of art that extend beyond textiles and quilts was just the range of different periods of history, of different techniques, to show that this is not a new concept, that artists have really been playing with these forms of making and these ideas for a very long time. And that really what our job is as the viewer, as the looker, as the interpreter, is to create and find a context for it. And that is a huge part of visual literacy. I spend most of my time as a classroom teacher. I teach at a college here in Nebraska. I teach studio art and art history and some general humanities classes. And in trying to figure out what we needed to do to engage the students, our best approach was to find multimodal ways of examining these topics. That one thing was not going to be enough, that just lecturing and presenting to the students would not deliver any more of a visual literacy than any other kind of just sitting and listening, but that the students needed to be engaged in conversation with us, in conversation with each other. We really, in order to develop this, we spent time looking at Nebraska state standards, like what is it that the education system is asking of students, not only from an artistic standpoint, but from any sort of literacy and cross-curricular working. So we asked the students to do a lot of things. We presented images from the Carolyn Mazlumi exhibition, where we asked them to create stories, write their own narratives from them. We gave them other works of art where we asked them to create tableaux vivants, which are basically their own reproduction, but with their own body. So embodying art. So talking about art, writing about art, creating stories, using their bodies to make art, we thought was a really great way to lead them into now make your own work of art. Think about your own story. We can assign all sorts of stories to other works of art, but what does it mean for you to think about Black, the color Black, how it applies to your life, in the ways that you can use it to shape something about who you are, what you feel, your perceptions, observations of the world. So that was our challenge, working together. And I think Sadé and I are such a great partnership because we have different skill sets and experiences with how we approach art making. So I thought we were very successful in leading them through all of those, that range of activities. So what you see here are installation shots. I'm going to kind of go through them just so you can see. We have some closer up examples of student works, but we did not limit the students at all. We said Black needs to be a visual, illusionary, conceptual component in your art making, but how you interpret that is really up to you. So we had students who made prints, students who made collages, students who used ink and charcoal and pencil and paint, students who crafted and sewed and created like this doll you see on the left. We have a closer up view of that later. That monitor was inserted, and that has digital representations. A student had an interesting play with auditory sound, with screeching and scratching and electric guitars. So what the color black might sound like. We had students write poetry, and this is what we wanted, right? Like we were less concerned with whether or not they could create interesting works via textile, but more about what is your mode of expression, and that it's not limited to certain materials, and that it's very open-minded. And we appreciate the open-mindedness of the museum because they had no expectation for what they wanted. They didn't say, please ask the students to make quilts. They said, please fill our space with works that really get the heart of what our mission is, which is using our collection to connect students in locally, globally, to explore and express their ideas through any kind of art object. And one of the amazing things was they allowed us to present the student work in the gallery. We just had a First Friday event on Friday where I think, Carolyn, 270 people attended, parents, grandparents, maybe people who have never been to the museum or wouldn't have thought to come. The students were able to talk about their ideas, express what was important to them, how Black shaped and formed the works of art that they produced for this. And that for me is always at the heart of the work Sadé and I do, is it's not really about us. I mean, we are sort of the instigators. We sort of come in, we play around, we create something new and interesting to present, but really it's your voice, providing those opportunities for you to express something. And if we have to be the conduit for that, then that's fine. And that's, it was just a really beautiful moment for me to kind of see that amount of support, because we weren't sure, you know, like sometimes that idea of being in a museum is a little far beyond for some people, but the students were so happy, their families were so happy, and any of the other visitors who were a part of that event were also enthralled from my conversations with the program. So in highlighting the student work, we do have a few examples. I'm not going to outline all of their thoughts and ideas. We were able to get written artist statements from all the students that visitors can use QR codes so they can actually read the students' works. So we didn't just let them make it. We asked them to write critically about their works of art as well, as sort of the final piece to making is also communicating what your art is, what your intentions were. So I'm not going to do that for the students. I will let the work speak for themselves. But I will sort of show you the range, a digital piece here. This is a really interesting painting that came with an interactive element where there was a blacklight flashlight where you can shine this light over the painting and it changes based on that interaction with where you shine the light, how long you shine the light. The thing that I didn't know was once you turn that off and take it away, that paint still like it still glows and it like fades again over time. And that to me was like amazing. I had no idea that the artwork did that. And the student did a great job of documenting that here. Like I said before, we had students interested in the very material, like sculptural, three-dimensional elements of art making, who spent a lot of time crafting this doll and with some found and used materials as well. We had a student use spray paint. You know, I just imagine like what this would have been like on a gallery wall. I don't think Carolyn would have let us put spray paint on that gallery wall. But I just really loved that piece. You know, more traditional approaches like painting, the viscerality of sort of the emotions, as well as more textile, yarn, thread-based pieces. So all in all, I was just, you know, as a teacher, I mostly work with college students. And sometimes the assumption is that you need to be at a certain period or time in your life in order to make critical observations and thoughts. And I think that really, for me, the goal that Sadé and I are trying to accomplish is to break down that assumption, that expectation, that stereotype that we can introduce all age ranges and groups of people to works of art. And very thoughtful, amazing things can emerge through those conversations, or and or acts of making. So that I think was really the heart of our project. And I don't believe we have another slide. So we can leave these images up, or we can take the images down and just sort of share ourselves. What are your thoughts, Sadé? We didn't really talk about this part. Or Carolyn, what do you think?
I think we can leave the images up in case people have questions specifically about images.
Perfect. Sounds great.
Yeah.
I think we're to the question part then.
Great. Thank you so much, Sadé and Chadric. I think that the students' work is so amazing. And I want to read a comment that Jan Rogers posted. She said, comment rather than a question. Love the way you've incorporated quilts as two-dimensional artworks into a focused conversation on a thematic topic. They offer such a range of imagery using the formal vocabulary of visual art and might be more approachable for students than traditional 2D artworks. Was that your experience? Did you feel that the quilts, what do you feel the quilts really brought to the project when you were chatting with the students?
I guess for me, Sadé and I, we didn't come to this project with any sort of expertise in quilts. In fact, this was a huge learning experience for me. I am a firm believer in how experiencing objects in person, I think Sadé mentioned this earlier as well, it really changes the way that you interact. And so for me, I do feel like quilts can maybe seem a little bit removed when working at a digital image, but once you bring the students into the gallery, which was something that Sadé was a huge part of with your staff at the museum, and maybe you can speak a little bit to this, Sadé. Once you bring them into the museum, then the quilts start to come to life. They do for me, for sure. And I agree that dimensionality, that tactility, the seeing the hand in there, it really makes I feel like it engages and connects students more with quilt making as an art form and not just an object that you use. But I don't know if you want to speak to your experiences giving those tours, Sadé, with the students and their thoughts.
I mean, I definitely agree with everything Chadric just said, and I think it won't be surprising to hear that many of the students really didn't work in fabric or any kind of textile art, and that for many of them, quilts weren't. They didn't necessarily see them as art objects. They had associations with them as, bed covers and maybe things that were of maybe even a completely different generation to their own. And so I think there was a lot of delight with coming to the museum and actually getting to be able to see them. Especially because they were looking not just at our exhibition, but at Matsulumi's exhibition and at the other exhibitions that were up. And I think there was such a wonderful range of artists, both making quilts specifically as art pieces, and for them to think about quilts both as art objects and to think of them as utilitarian objects that had then, been preserved and displayed as something unexpected for them. So I think that, though we only had a couple of people actually work in fabric for their final pieces, I think that students were really interested in the sort of human element of quilts and like looking at them as a thing that was assembled by hand in many cases. And I mean, I think by hand, even if you're using a sewing machine, it's still very much a hands-on experience. And I think that inspired a lot of them to think of quilts differently and to think about the possibility of stories being embedded in works in a different way than maybe they had thought about before. So I think it actually brought out some of their ability to talk about works and interpret them as, seeing the quilts as being like part human, part object in a way that maybe doesn't happen as much with other objects like paintings or sculpture.
I agree. I think when the students were in the gallery, they were very quiet. And I was really curious, but watching them, but when you can see the depth of a textile, even though it really is presented as a two-dimensional object, when you can see the depth of a quilt and the stitching and the layering and the texture, I think that opened their eyes in a really interesting way. And I do think that they came in with some assumptions, like so many people do, about what a quilt is and can be, and they were really blown away. And you really see that in their artwork. We had a couple of practical questions, and one that I did want to touch on was Sadé and Chadric, because it was a special challenge for them. And that was, the question is about what motivated Hortense Beck to create her quilt Black Boy, and what motivated the Quilt Study Center to acquire it. Hortense Beck was a really amazing quilt maker from Kansas who loved history. She loved history. She was from a family that settled in New York very early on in United States history, so that meant a lot to her. And so she went to museum collections, she went to photos of early quilts, and she decided that her thing was going to be to reproduce older quilts. She really wanted to understand them. She wanted to delve into them in an interesting way. So when we got to know Hortense Beck, frankly, one of the big reasons we loved her collection was because it could become part of our education collection, which was a particular group we were building at the time. The education collection are quilts that are specifically selected to be pulled out of the permanent collection so that they can be used in ways that give us more options to engage the public. So the education collection can go to places where they don't have the kind of lights that we use in the museum, that they can go to small libraries, they can go to, really it's a part of our land grant university expectations, is that we will give back to the community. So we looked at the education collection as a way to make our collection more available. However, when it came to Sadé and Chadric and trying to come up with the idea for their exhibition, it was very limiting to start with. It's a much smaller group of quilts that they're working with. And I have to admit, I'm still winnowing out that education collection. And there were some quilts that they would say, we really want to show this. And I said, oh, it's faded. It's not one that I think is going to work for you. Or I was trying to up that level of the education show or education collection. So talk to us a little bit about that challenge, because I think that was part of the development of your exhibition, was that challenge of working with the education collection.
Well, we learned fairly quickly that we had way less options to, well, I knew this because I in my initial search for images, I conducted the search wrong. So I was in your permanent collection. I thought, wow, we have a lot to work with here. But once I fixed sort of those search, I think we began to realize almost immediately how limited we would be just in terms of the amount of objects to work from. But we did find that there were quite a few images or objects, quilt objects, that used black. So for us, I think it was a challenge, but it was also, sometimes when you're limited, more creativity emerges because you have to use a collection more creatively. So we weren't able to maybe rest on some of our initial inclinations when it comes to curation and selecting objects. You know, there were a few things, Sadé mentioned this, that reminded me of these beautiful prints by Aaron Douglas that are in the collection of the Sheldon Museum. So thank you for reminding me of that. You know, there was sort of the silhouette of the black figure. So yeah, for us, I think that limitation provided more opportunities for creativity, was my experience, even though it was especially difficult because you have to kind of make with what you have at that moment. Do you have anything you would like to add, Sadé?
I think I mean, yes, I agree that's true. I think we did sort of have to come up with an idea based on what we had, and it forced us to be more creative. I think part of it though really was just that at that time we were still trying to be so much in conversation with the Mazlumi show that the ideas that we were having about you know, works by Black makers or works that were somehow representing Black figures or Black people, we just weren't finding what we like, the amount that we needed to fill the space. I think that was really the sticking point, as well as, you know, maybe just having seen so many quilts in the main collection that really sparked us, maybe not seeing the same variety of quilts in the education collection, or maybe not the same quality. So I think we were sort of having to parse through as well, just finding things that we liked aesthetically, as well as things that would go together, as well as things that would allow us to tell the story that we wanted to tell. So it turned out to be a really interesting challenge. And I think that perhaps what made it challenging was that we didn't know from the very beginning that we were going to use the education quilts. I think we had the impression that we had access to the entire, which really I think was just because we heard what we wanted to hear. I think we had the idea that we had the option to use anything in the collection, and then, but if we had known we were going into to the education collection from the beginning, I think it would have been a different experience. But I think it turned out to be a really thrilling experience, nonetheless, despite the challenges.
Yeah. Well, there's just a couple more questions quickly about the education collection. Education collection is probably about 300 quilts now. It really represents more of our traditional American art quilts, or American traditional quilts. Typically, we don't know a maker, we don't have a lot of provenance. We look at all those factors when we move something into the education collection. So we do not have an education collection of art quilts yet. It's something we're considering, because again, that gives our artists the opportunity to exhibition and gives us a lot more freedom for exhibition. So the education collection is really was really geared more towards a traditional American art form. We had another question just about the difficulty of lighting the exhibition, and I will say, the Beavers Gallery, where this show was installed, is an open space. So when we take pictures and for the slide program, we get a lot of variation in the amount of light, because it depends if it's a sunny day outside. There's some exposure out from the outside elements. The show is much more evenly lit when you see it in person or in the overall gallery space than our photos show. So some of these other questions that we get, though, and that actually someone also mentioned about, you know, like one of the challenges of using Black fabrics is that they fade easily. So there's no real way to prevent that at all, I'm afraid, except keeping things out of light as much as possible. And that's why the education collections can be shown anywhere, because we don't limit that light exposure, knowing that that is going to cause some damage in these quilts, but we are balancing that with the fact that they don't have a lot of provenance. They are very similar to other quilts that we have in the collection. And some of our donors say, I want to give these quilts for the education collection because I want them to be seen. And we always try to balance preservation and accessibility, which is always a challenge. A couple other questions. Can you share something that you learned from the students, something that surprised you or you didn't foresee as you went through the discussions and expressions with the students?
Yeah, so I think, you know, overall, something that I learned throughout the entire experience is just how difficult these kinds of programs are to run and to conduct, the amount of coordination, collaboration, flexibility, improvisation, even at times that you have to have, makes these kinds of educational programs difficult, but also rewarding, because anybody who has experience with art and art making, that is the beauty of it, is the unexpected, the things that emerge throughout. And so I think for me, I really loved that the students seemed to have that flexibility in our conversations, to not come with too many expectations, and hopefully we disrupted maybe some of them about what we would do in our programming and what we didn't. So for me, it's really about leaning into that when it comes to community programming, is that as organized as Sadé and I are, you know, there are elements that are out of our control, and you have to lean into that as a part of the process, and be comfortable with that. You know, I'm not saying I'm there 100%, But I do think that the whole process and experience becomes more rich when you understand that to be a critical element of this kind of work.
I think one of the things that surprised me was how, we gave the students such a wide berth when it came to what they could make, what materials they could use. All we said was that it had to have, that Black needed to be a major component in the storytelling in their work. And, I thought there would be more people who would really play around with issues with the elements of contrast and illusion. But just because I think those are interesting and fun, and maybe even just part of the technical experience of learning to make images, is sort of how you make contrast, how you give illusion. And so, but pretty much everybody really dove in headfirst on a conceptual and a conceptual image, using Black to communicate something about themselves, their sort of feelings, their interiority. And so it was really, I think, interesting to see that. I'll also say that I was surprised at how, even though they really could make anything, and maybe this was our, as well, it's hard to know how much guidance that you should give people, but even though they were able to really do anything or make anything, there was a lot of people who seemed very hesitant and sort of very overwhelmed by not knowing what to do and what to create. So I think, it reminded me of how important that it is to really try to give young people as much room to be creative and think for themselves as possible, because when given the opportunity to do whatever you want, you don't shut down and feel like, oh, I don't know what to do. And so it just was sort of an interesting sort of pedagogical moment for me to see that.
Chadric, we've had a couple questions, some people who wanted to see more of the student work, and I can show that on my screen. So if you want to stop your share screen, I will share mine, and I will, as we're talking, I'll just flip through some more of the specific images of the students' work. So I'm gonna open this up. While I'm doing this, and I'll start showing these images, we had another question. Someone just wanted to learn a little bit more about the process of establishing the project with the students. How long was the project? Did you work with them session by session? Just a little bit more information about the actual project.
Well, we actually went through a few other community partners before we ended up here, and for various reasons, based on the demographic of the students, the sort of responsiveness of their teams, any number of things, we sort of ended up having to scrap those ideas. In terms of how we ended up with the Arts and Humanities School, I mean, me being from Lincoln, Nebraska originally, I knew about the Arts and Humanities program, and Chadric and I had previously worked with LPS. We weren't with the Arts and Humanities program, but we were with another high school group in an earlier program that we did. And then also the Quilt Museum has a relationship with Arts and Humanities, and LPS broadly has a relationship with the museums in Lincoln, Nebraska, because students go on a tour at some point in their primary school tenure. So all of those things made it really easy for us to establish and reach out to Arts and Humanities, kind of, again, cold calling. So we really just simply found a contact, reached out to them, told them about the project, asked them if they would be willing to lend us their students for a while. And then we really just worked the project out together with them. So we ended up being in the classroom over the course of 3 weeks. This particular humanities class that they offer, the students meet 3 times a week, and for the whole semester. And we took up 3 weeks and spent programmed for three days of the week. And then we're actually physically in the room with the students for 2 days, where we did our various like lectures and discussions. And then we gave them the last week really to start working on their art making, and so that they could have some time to do that in class. And then we were able to organize a field trip so that the students could go to the Quilt Museum and look around at the objects in person and really be able to engage with the exhibition and our ideas. And then the students were left with a few more weeks, I believe, after the museum visit to continue working on their projects. Now, Chadric and I weren't directly involved with the art making outside of that 1 week that we gave them in class. The teachers at the Arts and Humanities were really leading the rest of the art making. And so we were able then to circle back when everything was done, and we made some selections. So what you see here actually isn't all of the works. There were about 60 students in the program, and we maybe met with maybe 45 of them. I believe none of the seniors participated in this program. So of those like 45 objects, we selected the ones that we thought were the strongest, and the students were aware that this was going to end up being a selection process. We gave them that information from the very beginning, so they understood that not everybody's work was going to be represented. So we chose the ones that we thought were the strongest, both visually and in terms of the statements that they were writing, in terms of how they were explaining how Black was at work in their object. And then we were able to install those works into the exhibition. So Black at Work, our exhibition was actually up for a few weeks before the student work was then added into the space. Did I forget anything along the way?
No, I think that was an accurate representation.
Great. One other question, and we are getting down to maybe just 4 or 5 minutes left, guys. I hate to cut us off, but one of the other questions, can you share some of what the artist's comments were regarding Black in their artwork? And I know we don't have the artist statements in front of us, but do you recall some of what the students talked about, how they used Black in their work?
Yeah, I have some thoughts just from Friday night. One student described Black as a space for exploration, right? That often Black is associated with some sort of emptiness or void. But for this particular student, they felt like Black provided a space to explore who you are outside of expectations from other people and their identity. And I think that one of the common themes that we see with a lot of the arts and humanities students is that this particular space is a place for students to express those forms of who they are, maybe outside of the comfortability that they would in sort of the mainstream public schools, where these students do play with different kinds of expression, and the teachers encourage that and that they support that. And so I do feel like that was a huge theme in a lot of the students' work, was about identity, about openness, about the exploration and play. So I think that for me was the strongest example that I can remember, that I really loved seeing that art is impacting who they are and how they shape themselves and how they see themselves in the world. All beautiful things. So I don't know, Sadé, if you have anything in particular that you remember, but that for me was, I loved hearing that at the museum that night.
Well, I was just so impressed with the students that came to First Friday last week and stood in front of the crowd with a microphone and shared such really heartfelt thoughts about their artwork. And like I said, they were, and Sadé, you and I talked about this, where the students were really quiet while they were at the museum, and you didn't get a lot of feedback from them. And then when their artwork came out and they spoke about it, the emotion and thoughtfulness of the students was really amazing. We had just one more comment or question. A couple people have mentioned that, Carolyn Maslumi makes quilts right now in black and white. And did the students have an opportunity to interact with those quilts? We have Carolyn's collection hanging right now. We have about 60 works of Carolyn's collection, but she chose not to show her work in this exhibition. She wanted to feature other artists. So no, the students did not have an opportunity to work directly with Carolyn Maslumi's quilts. I am so sorry to say that we are out of time. I cannot tell you how much I have really enjoyed working with you. Your professionalness, your excitement has just been infectious. And it was the most lovely thing to see the parents, the grandparents, everyone come on Friday night and really celebrate those students. And it kind of reminded me how exciting it was for them to have their work in a museum. And what a great project. I'm just so thrilled we could work with you, and we're looking forward to future projects now. So we don't have plans to repeat this particular project, but I hope we have other options, and it's certainly a model we will follow for the future. So time to thank our sponsors. Thank you guys so much for coming today and talking to us, Sadé and Chadric, and thank you for everyone for attending. And Lucy, let's go ahead and thank our sponsors again. Thanks, everybody.